Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad was formed in 1847 in Chicago, Illinois, then known as the Rock Island and LaSalle Railroad, with construction beginning on October 1st, 1851, with the first train making its inaugural run just over a year later on October 10th, 1852, from Chicago to Joliet, Illinois. Construction would continue through LaSalle, and on February 22nd, 1854, the Rock Island would reach its namesake of Rock Island, Illinois. This would in turn give the Rock Island the distinction of the first railroad to reach the Mississippi River. Then, through a subsidiary created by original Rock Island investors known as the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad, the company would reach all the way down to Council Bluffs, Iowa, as well as Davenport, Iowa. The M&M would be acquired by the Rock Island on July 9th, 1866. In addition to Illinois and Iowa, the Rock Island's territory would eventually reach Arkansas, Colorado, Kansas, Louisiana, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, New Mexico, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and Texas. Again, with the furthest point east of the Rock Island's territory being Chicago. And in addition to this point, it also reached Memphis, Tennessee. The company also spread itself out west to Denver, Colorado, Santa Rosa, New Mexico, Galveston, Texas, and Eunice, Louisiana. Heading north, the railroad went as far as Minneapolis, Minnesota. Other major cities the Rock Island would eventually serve include Des Moines, Iowa, St. Louis, Missouri, as well as Harrington, Kansas. The Rock Island Line, or ROC as it was known for short, would thus become a massive Class I U.S. railroad whose reach extended through the Midwest, as well as the South and throughout the western states, covering a total of 7,183 miles of the United States, with a total system length of 10,669 miles. This never counting, of course, all yards and branch lines the company owned. Its end, however, would come quickly and suddenly, but unfortunately was all but foreseeable even in its early days. The main factors working against the Rock Island are essentially what made railroads very easy to finance back in these days. Mind you, this is a time before internet companies, let alone hedge funds, existed. Any investor that was any investor wanted to put their money into a railroad. Why? Because they made money. They were known for making money. This common, at least somewhat misguided belief / reputation that the railroads had was spurred on by the fact that railroads really had transportation to themselves during this period in time in the United States, especially in the landlocked Midwest. This would cause situations to come about where less than scrupulous people, for example, would form a railroad company for the sake of getting financing for it. Then once the stock had climbed to a certain point after enough investors had bought into it, the original founders of said railway company would essentially pump the stock up as high as possible and then essentially dump the stock once it was very clear it had peaked, essentially setting said railroad adrift. In other cases, there were simply less knowledgeable businessmen and women starting railroads up for the sake of starting a railroad up because they made money. This is the same lack of knowledge that got a lot of people to throw money at railroad companies even if the company clearly had no hope of surviving and or would have serious issues surviving. Despite the fact it was one of the first railroads being built in this part of the United States, the Rock Island certainly would qualify as one of these companies. On paper, the company looked like a sure bet, providing faster transportation in a part of the United States which at that time did not have anything resembling this, requiring days to make trips across this part of the country, normally utilizing the Mississippi River as well as a stagecoach to make up the journey. A railroad, specifically because it had more direct connections to inland destinations, could easily reduce this to a single day if not just a few hours, especially later on as railroad technology improved and train speeds began to increase. Then there was also the fact the company was set up in what was called the breadbasket of the United States, with plenty of agricultural traffic, and essentially in the main division point or hub of the country itself. This point being Chicago, meaning in this case, a point where all the traffic would come together, coming from east, south, north, and west, as all railroad traffic would have to converge at this point to get directed on to its final destination if it were being routed through the Midwest. The trouble is, the Rock Island was not the only railroad in this particular area. The Chicago Northwestern Railroad, for example, had started up that same year and operated much in the same territory as the Rock Island. This company would be followed by the Missouri Pacific, better known as the MOPEC, and then the Milwaukee Road. All three of these railroads essentially had similar business plans, covering the Midwest as well as the West Coast United States, running to the same states and pulling the same traffic. With this particular section of the market for the Midwest and Western United States this badly saturated, competition would become fierce, leading to price wars. As early as 1915, the Rock Island Railroad, due to this and mismanagement of its finances and other such problems, quickly found itself in bankruptcy. This would happen again in 1933. Admittedly, the second bankruptcy could easily be attributed to the depression that was taking place in the United States at that time. However, it was a sign of things to come. After securing the necessary financing, the Rock Island would break out of the depression by ordering several lightweight stainless steel passenger cars called streamlined passenger cars for use on its new high-speed trains it would nickname the Rockets. The company's main line would be completely overhauled to allow for trains to operate at up to 90 miles per hour. This would allow the Rock Island to promote itself as being a fast freight as well as passenger railroad, giving it an identity that stuck out in this overbuilt region. But the overbuilt part of this equation would become a major issue as the 30s wore on, especially after World War II, with the end of gasoline rationing and rubber rationing, plus the creation of the interstate highway system by the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. Cars and trucks began to cut into a large part of the Rock Island's business, which was, unfortunately for the Rock Island at this point, cut from the same pie that it shared with the rest of the railroads, such as the Chicago Northwestern, MoPec, and the Milwaukee Road. In short, this already oversaturated section of the United States railroads was about to become even more saturated, but by trucks, who, unlike the railroads, would not actually have to own and build the roads they drove on. Thus, an extremely out-of-touch ICC, which seemed to be stuck in a bygone era where railroads dominated the transportation market, whose members may have had influence from car manufacturers of the time, made being a railroad in the Midwestern United States ever more challenging, especially as time moved on. The tipping point came in the 1970s with a fuel crisis that threatened to strangle all of the transportation systems in the United States. The railroads being at a huge, and quite unfair for that matter, disadvantage in this sort of situation, as in addition to the normal taxes that all transportation companies needed to pay and need to pay in the United States to this day, railroads had to pay taxes upon the right-of-ways, aka the tracks they own from point A to point B, as well as maintain those tracks. Now, one might think that all of these issues facing the Rock Island were brought upon by the company not having foresight and failing to innovate. Far from it. The company had plenty of innovations under its belt. For example, the territories the railroad occupied had a lot of high-density commuting, and thus the company was a pioneer in some of the modern concepts of a commuter train, most notably the dual-mode locomotive, aka the road switcher. The concept was developed specifically for the railroad's Granger lines, a line known basically for running through an agricultural district that, in addition to needing the ability to obviously haul grain, wheat, and other such agricultural products, also needed passenger service. And I might add very low-density passenger service. The only way this makes sense is to have an engine that can essentially do it all. This is where the concept of the road switcher comes from. Alco would be the first to take up this concept, although GM did have a similar type engine, which essentially was an extended variant of its NW line of switchers, but it referred to it as a terminal switcher designed to take occasional passenger service and mainly handle switching jobs around passenger terminals. That said, the bespoke built for the Rock Island Alco RS-1 was the first successful road switcher in terms of profitability in the United States, and would spawn a whole new generation of road switchers from Alco, which would eventually be followed up upon by GM with its GP7 and 9 models. Needless to say, this class of locomotives was used extensively on the Granger lines for the Rock Island Railroad, as well as some of its other commuter areas. The main advantage, again, was that the engine could be used for both freight and passengers, as well as short-haul locals, which made up a lot of the agricultural dealings the Rock Island was involved with, and thus could be justified for a low-density section of railroading for both jobs, but could also be utilized as a freight locomotive on other lines in a pinch if necessary, as well as a switcher, saving the company millions and millions of dollars, as it only had to maintain one class of locomotive and fewer of them to essentially accomplish all the jobs required for this low-density railroading. And the road switcher type locomotive would become essentially the only type locomotive being manufactured in North America, with a few exceptions. This had become a very intelligent and very necessary move for the company, as it unfortunately would begin to develop business problems based upon its business model. The Rock Island's troubles had started as far back in the 1950s as management began to realize that the company was essentially a big fish in a small pond. Essentially, there were too many railroads in its area of operations. These railroads included the MoPec, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, who would eventually become the Burlington Northern, the Milwaukee Road, as well as the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. All of these companies were competing for the same traffic, and thus there would not be enough to go around and keep the company afloat and viable. The only way to survive, it was thought, was to merge with another company. And to its credit, the Rock Island at this point would make the judgment call to start looking for a merger partner, before the situation got to the point where it was unsustainable. With attempts to merge with the Chicago and Northwestern as well as the Milwaukee Road falling apart essentially before they got started, the railroad in which the company would eventually choose to be its merger partner would be the Union Pacific. This would create a mega system of a railroad that would cover the Midwest as well as the West United States. The process of merging with the UP would begin in 1964, which incidentally was the Rock Island's last year of profitability. Getting this approved, though, would take some time, as well as some wining and dining and feasibility studies, both of which would be paid for by the Rock Island in an effort to make the railroad appealing as a takeover partner. Unfortunately, this is where the company made a fatal mistake. Instead of doing its best to keep its equipment up and looking for new business solutions to keep surviving, it instead would go the other way and start cutting back on maintenance to its rolling stock and equipment as well as its tracks, doing the absolute minimal to keep the company going, so it would have enough cash to survive until the upcoming merger. The logic being that the company didn't need to maintain things beyond a certain point, the company assuming that the UP merger would be approved long before this took a serious toll on the railroad. The end result, when all the hurdles had finally been cleared and the Union Pacific was indeed interested in buying the company, and protests from nearly every neighboring railroad in the territories the Rock Island served were finally gone through, which further lengthened an already lengthy approval process by the ICC, and the ICC had finally given its long-awaited clearance, the whole process totaling 10 years. The Rock Island had allowed itself to deteriorate to the point where it looked like something out of a war zone and was certainly not the Union Pacific's first choice as a merger partner. The end result, the Union Pacific walked away from the deal and the Rock Island was set adrift yet again in 1974. Attempts were made to bring the Rock Island back from the brink, and they actually were quite successful. With John W. Ingram now at the helm of the company acquired several loans to rebuild itself, pulling tracks literally out of the ground that had been allowed to deteriorate into nothing, and new as well as rebuilt locomotives were acquired and painted into a sky blue paint scheme to give the company a whole new look. The company had even entered into successful talks to sell its Golden State route to the Southern Pacific to further increase available revenue. This highly ambitious and seemingly highly unlikely plan seemed to be well on its way to success, nearly getting the company back to profitability range by the late 1970s, despite the economy being hit very badly that year by an energy crisis. Unfortunately, several things were against the railroad, including the vast majority of the company's investors, who were getting tired of waiting for the company to finally turn a profit for the first time again since 1964. It was now 1980. And essentially all of the local area railroads, who by banding together managed to stop loans that were to be approved to help the company restructure, as the Rock Island Railroad would only serve to be a huge detriment to these companies. There was also the fact that the company had failed to join Amtrak in 1971. This is again due to the Rock Island's strict policy of spending as little money as possible at this point to help it survive the period it continued to take on debt until it was finally taken over by the Union Pacific. The Rock Island was therefore not released from these responsibilities and had to continue to run its own passenger trains in addition to its commuter trains, both of which, much like most of the commuter trains and passenger trains in the United States at that time, were essentially dropped anchors, causing the company to incur even more debt. By this point in time, its commuter trains were composed of aging E units from EMD, some of which were bought used from the Union Pacific, and early 1900s era passenger coaches. There were a few exceptions to this in the form of double-decker modern commuter cars. The last straw appeared to be a strike that was organized by the Brotherhood of Airline and Railway Clerks, which occurred in 1979. Unhappy with their outdated work agreement, they essentially walked off the job, despite pleas from the management to take a look at the books and see the precarious financial situation the Rock Island was in. Determined to not let this strike stop the company from recovering, Ingram and the upper management team worked together to keep the traffic moving and getting the clerk's job done, assisted by the few clerks who dared to cross the picket lines. A tonnage continued to increase, and by the 6th week of the strike, the company had somehow managed to move 30% of its pre-strike tonnage. This number would eventually increase to 80%. Despite this, however, the ICC came to the conclusion that the Rock Island Railroad would not be able to survive the strike, or move 1979's grain harvest, and issued an emergency order for the Kansas City Terminal Railroad to take over the Rock Island's operations so that the grain shipments would be made, even though it had successfully moved some grain out of Iowa the previous week before the order had been issued. Then on January 24th, 1980, The judge appointed to oversee the reorganization of the Rock Island, Judge McGarr, refused to even so much as look at the company's final reorganization plan and ordered the liquidation of the railroad to start immediately. This was despite the fact that the railroad had a projected profit of that year of at least $5 million. The company was not sold as one unit but largely dissected, with several different parts going to different companies and some parts being abandoned. One of the most notable companies formed out of the ashes of the Rock Island Railroad is the Iowa Interstate Railroad, in partnership with the Heartland Rail Corporation. The company began operations in 1984, just 4 years after the Rock Island had folded, by acquiring control of the former main line from Omaha, Nebraska to Chicago, Illinois, by means of a lease with its partner, the Heartland Rail Corporation, who had bought the line from the assets of the Rock Island Railroad for a price of $31 million, 15 of which came from a loan from the Iowa Railway Finance Authority. The company would then negotiate an extension to its territory into Chicago the following year in 1985 by negotiating trackage rights with CSX Transportation and Metra. While the Iowa Interstate's early years of operations proved to be trials and tribulations for the company, almost sending it to bankruptcy, its fortunes turned around drastically when its partner Heartland Rail Corporation purchased the company outright in 1991. Since then, the Iowa Interstate Railroad has become a thriving United States Class II railroad. Considering the former Rock Island Railroad's lack of success with this particular line, one would wonder how any railroad would have made this line profitable. As it turns out, frustratingly enough, the seeds to the success of this particular company were planted just as the Rock Island was going bankrupt, thanks to a deregulatory bill that was passed through the U.S. House of Representatives and eventually the Senate, called the Staggers Act. In 1980, the same year the Rock Island went into liquidation. Named after one of the bill's chief authors, Harley O. Staggers, it was essentially deregulation that gutted the ICC's ability to regulate railroads, and all but set it up to be erased from existence. Among the more critical regulations that were loosened with this act were the ability for railroads to abandon tracks that were not profitable instead of forcing them to operate them in debt. The Staggers Act also gave the U.S. railroads almost direct control over the rates they set for traffic. Critical factors that could have saved the Penn Central from going kaput, although admittedly that railroad had its own problems. Feel free to check out my video on railroading in the United States in the 1970s for more information. Further regulations were put into effect in terms of pay rates for railroads that were not Class 1s. These allowed Class 2 and higher railroads to have more flexible work hours as well as labor rates than the Class 1s had. This, however, only makes the demise of the Rock Island Railroad even more frustrating, as had the railroad company only existed a little bit longer, they may have very well been able to turn their fortunes around, with the regulations that were holding the company back and pulling it down into bankruptcy almost completely eliminated, and other new business practices such as road railers, which allowed trekking companies to ship their tractor-trailers part of their way on trains, reducing the expenses for both the railroads and the trucking companies alike, gave railroads a further shot in the arm. As for the commuter runs, they were taken over by Metra, who had already previously begun assuming the responsibility for much of the commuter service provided by the Rock Island. All of this put together could have saved the Rock Island from going over the falls, and it may well exist today had this been allowed to happen. Unfortunately, due to the fact that it failed to show a profit in 20 years, its investors getting fed up with this, and of course the ICC with its regulatory issues, which still had control up until the point where the company did finally fail, plus the company's cost-cutting practices it put into place as it attempted to merge with the Union Pacific and waited for the ICC to come to a decision on that matter. The company is now largely just a memory. Or is it? In 2017, a career railroader by the name of Robert J. Riley acquired the intellectual property of the Rock Island and renamed his contracting switching service railroad, which was incorporated in Hannah, Mississippi, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific. The company would eventually reach an agreement to lease the 60-mile-long Mississippi Delta Railroad, as well as to operate it, thanks to, at least in part, all the deregulatory actions taken after the original Rock Island went bankrupt in 1980. This currently Class 3 railroad is looking to expand further, beyond its now current length of 110 miles. And so, unlike most bankrupt and liquidated companies from this era, the Rock Island Railroad appears to have 9 lives. It can't be predicted, of course, whether or not this outfit will ever become a Class 1 railroad again. One thing is for sure, the Rock Island has been brought back to life, even if it's in another form. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please like and subscribe as it will help me greatly. And as always, keep the metal side down.